I hope you all got a copy of the handout. I won't be referring to the handout directly very much, but if you look on, you'll find it takes up the points I'm taking up in roughly the order I'm taking them up, and I'll also put any longer quotations I'll be reading on the handout so you can read aloud. Now, in these lectures, my purpose will be to explain why there is such a thing as the good. The sense of good I have in mind is primarily the sense that's at issue when we speak of the human good, or of someone's having a good life, or of an outcomes being good for someone, or of something being a good end and so worthy of pursuit. It's the sense that John Rawls had in mind when he spoke of someone's conception of the good, where Rawls understood that as a conception of what is of value in life and what's worth aiming at. To give it a name, I'm going to call that sense the final good, borrowing one familiar translation for the Greek word telos. Now, naturally, an investigation into why there is such a thing as the final good will involve us in considering the relation of the final good to what's good in some other familiar senses. We will, for example, consider the relation to the final good to what's good in the evaluative sense, the sense that we invoke when we say that good knives are sharp, good books are well written, and good teachers are patient and understanding. We'll also consider the relation of the final good to the morally good, and the relation of something's being good for you in the final sense to something's being good for you in the sense that getting plenty of exercise and eating vegetables is good for you. I'll be talking about that tomorrow. All of these other senses of the good and their relation to the final good will come up in the course of our investigation. Now, many of you will already have views, either explicit or unquestioned, about some of these relations. You may, for instance, suppose that when we say good life or good end, we're using good in the evaluative sense. So that, for example, good life or good end is to be understood on the model of good knife or good teacher. Or you may suppose, as some contemporary Aristotelians do, that it's obvious or even analytic that someone whose life is good in the moral sense has achieved the human good in the final sense. I'll discuss whether some of these things are true, some of them today, but if you're to understand my question, it's important that you set your assumptions about these relations aside for now and simply focus on good in the final sense, the sense we have in mind when we talk about the good or the human good or the good life. So the question I'm raising is why there is such a thing. Now, just by asking that question, I'm expressing some substantial philosophical commitments. And although it will take us away from the direct question of the good for a while, I'm going to begin by talking about these commitments because this will be a way of giving you a clearer idea of what I'm trying to do here. After all, many philosophers who are philosophical realists about value would deny that it makes any sense to ask why there's such a thing as the good. For them, the good is, to use Tim Scanlon's term, fundamental. That is, it cannot be explained in naturalistic terms or even in other normative terms. Perhaps, like G.E. Moore, they believe that some things simply have intrinsic value. On Moore's view, which we'll be considering later today, intrinsic value is just a property that a thing may have, perhaps supervenient on the thing's natural properties, but not one whose existence admits of any further explanation. On Moore's view, the final good for a human being is to achieve or acquire those intrinsically good things, or to somehow be involved in them. Or a realist about the good may be a buck passer, again, to use Tim Scanlon's terms. A buck passer, in Scanlon's terms, is someone who believes that to say that something is good is just to say that there are reasons to have certain attitudes towards it and to treat it in certain ways. This view can be tempting because it turns out there are many different things we have in mind when we say that something is good in itself or that someone values it as good. For example, some people think that we value, say, pleasures or good states of affairs by trying to maximize their production. But we value works of art by contemplating them attentively. We may also try to produce them but it would be a little odd to suppose we should try to maximize their production, to cover every inch of wall space with beautiful paintings, say. We value people by respecting their choices and promoting their interests, but not certainly by trying to maximize their production, having a lot of babies, nor usually by contemplating them attentively. So there's not much we can say about what values have in common, except that they generate various reasons. So the buck passer thinks. Now the buck passer, like Scanlon himself, may think that those reasons themselves are fundamental. That is, there's no explanation of why they exist. Then, although the existence of the good can be explained in terms of the existence of reasons, the more general existence of value or practical normativity is still, on the buck-passing account, something fundamental. Now, there's something else that's fundamental on the buck-passing account, which is going to be important to us and which concerns the distinction between goodness and badness. After all, a buck passer about the good will also be a buck passer about the bad. It too will involve having reasons to have certain attitudes towards things and treat them in certain ways. And since these reasons are various in nature, we might wonder how exactly the buck passer is going to distinguish the good from the bad. To say either that something is good or that it's bad is to say that it generates a bunch of practical reasons. So how are the two ideas really different? What accounts for what we might call the positive valence of the good and the negative valence of the bad? In Scanlon's account, this problem is passed on to the attitudes and actions for which there are reasons. To claim that something's good is to claim that there's reason to have positive attitudes and intentions towards it. Well, to say that it's bad is to say that there are reasons for negative attitudes and intentions. But it's not clear that that will work, because what we would intuitively regard as positive value is often a reason, certainly, for negative attitudes. It's those who value poetry who despise doggerel, for example, and justice expresses itself more often than not in indignation. But even assuming that this problem can be overcome, valence, according to the buck passer, is, like value itself, fundamental. Now, I reject these kinds of views because of a commitment to what I'm going to call philosophical naturalism. I take philosophical naturalism to be the view that at the fundamental level, the world is the one that the natural sciences describe to us. There are two kinds of philosophical naturalists. First, there are reductive naturalists who believe that everything in the world, everything we meet and use and deal with, everything we talk about and represent in our theories, can be either reduced to the kind of entity that the natural sciences traffic in more directly, or must be dismissed as unreal. And notice here, I'm ignoring the further question whether everything that the natural sciences traffic in can be reduced to the categories used in physics. A familiar form of this view holds that if a thing does not play a role in giving scientific explanations of the phenomena, then there is no reason to suppose that it actually exists. As an example of the sort of thing I have in mind, you might take Gilbert Harman's famous argument for moral skepticism. Harman proposed that skepticism about moral facts is justified because we need not appeal to moral facts in order to explain people's moral judgments. We can explain people's moral judgments in terms of their moral beliefs, and perhaps we can explain those in terms of their upbringing, and so on. Now, according to non-reductive naturalists, this is not so. The world contains all sorts of things that play no role in giving scientific explanations. But we can't treat them as fundamental. And in some cases, it's the business of the philosopher to explain why they exist. And that's what I think about the final good. Now, I'm going to use an analogy here that I hope you'll find helpful. Many things in the world exist because they are, in the most literal way, human constructions. Artifacts and inventions. Such things are tables and chairs, buildings and machines, roads and fences and bridges. Like moral values, if Harman is right about those, these things play no essential role in giving scientific explanations of the phenomena, except when they figure as objects of thought. How did he come to be bitten? I asked. He sat down on a dozing camel because he mistook it for a chair. Or to take a similar case, I ask, why is he sitting right there? And you say, well, it was the nearest empty chair when he came into the room. Now, in that last case, the appeal to thought is not explicit, yet you have to mean that he thought it was the nearest empty chair, or saw it as such, or the explanation wouldn't work. When thoughts are not involved in the explanation of whatever it is you're trying to explain, the science can treat the chair as a peculiarly shaped solid object, or a collection of molecules or physical forces, or something like that. When thoughts are not involved, the fact that it is a chair is of no importance. Something similar is true when the thoughts or representations of creatures who have no regular dealings with furniture are involved in the explanation. A bird may perch on the back of the chair because she represents its back the way she represents the branch of a tree, as a place where you can be safe from the animals below. Now, those reflections are completely banal, but they push us towards a startling conclusion. We ordinarily think of tables and chairs as the plainest of realities, but in fact, they are ideal objects existing only in thought. They are mind-dependent entities. Or to put it a better way, a way I borrow from Bernard Williams, they are perspective-dependent entities. That's a better way to put the point, because mind-dependent might lead us to forget that ideality in this sense is not just a matter of our attitudes or what we might think. One might suppose, for instance, that colors are perspective dependents, existing only in the view of creatures with color vision. Some perspectives are created by practical need. Furniture is perspective dependent in this way. A chair, for example, exists in the perspective of a creature like you, an upright, two-legged animal who occasionally needs to sit down. Rational animals on another planet who were oval and legless and swam through their environments like fish could only grasp chairs as objects of thought by looking at the world through the perspective of creatures like ourselves. Now, I mention this because there's a great deal of talk about mind dependence in moral philosophy these days. Some philosophers think that if values are mind dependent, then it follows that they are subjective in some sense, that implies that they cannot be, as philosophers like to say, truth-apt. Meta-ethical theories that have traditionally been categorized as non-cognitivist are accused of rendering values mind-dependent, in the sense that they're dependent on our attitudes, on our desires or our norms or our plans or something of that sort. But these days, the contemporary heirs to the non-cognitivists, the expressivists, are scrambling to assure us that they do not believe that values are mind-dependent. That's because the view that something is mind-dependent is supposed to imply that thinking makes it so, or anyway, attitude makes it so, with the implication that we could change the truth about value just by changing our minds or our attitudes. Expressivists nowadays distance themselves from this conclusion by arguing that whether a value is mind-dependent is simply a normative question about the content of the value. When I call something a virtue, for instance, I am not just saying that I like it. I am saying that it is a property that I approve of, a person having, whether he himself approves of that property or not. So when I say, for instance, benevolence is a virtue, I commit myself to the view that benevolence would be a virtue even if I were a self-interested lout who thought it was only for fools. So I don't think its virtuousness depends on my attitudes. Okay, but why should we want to distance ourselves from mind dependence, or from perspective dependence more generally? Although tables and chairs are perspective-dependent idealities and only figure in scientific explanations as objects of thought, it would be quite extraordinary to conclude that we therefore have reason to be skeptical about them, or to suppose that the facts about them are whatever any one person chooses to think. Furniture is something real, and there are many well-established facts about it. The man who got bitten because he mistook a dozing camel for a chair made an actual mistake and has the camel's tooth marks to prove it. But, you might reply, furniture facts are not good enough to be our model for value facts, because furniture facts are, after all, pretty squishy. You could use a camel for a chair, after all, if you had some way to keep the animal calm. The man's mistake, you might say, was not really that he took a camel for a piece of furniture, but that he failed to notice that even if the camel was a chair, she was also a camel. Within certain limits, which may seem to be largely pragmatic, we do just get to decide what counts as a chair. So we need to take another step here. There are facts about Chippendale sofas. For example, the lectern at which I'm now speaking is not one. But these facts only came into existence with Chippendale sofas themselves, and Chippendale sofas are an invention. There might never have been any such things, and there might have been something else altogether that occupies the space they occupy in our lives. We don't want to say that something like that is true of our values. But that's because Chippendale sofas are, as it were, too specific. There need not have been Chippendale sofas, but could there have failed to be furniture? Or is furniture something that for creatures like us must exist, despite its perspective-dependent nature? Now, another example will help here. David Hume, when he undertook to tell us whether justice is something natural or artificial, balked slightly at the question. Justice, he said, is a human invention, but an invention so necessary, given the conditions of human life, that any human society must have justice. Now, in order to understand Hume's argument, you need to know that Hume thought of justice primarily as a matter of establishing and upholding property rights. He had a kind of limited conception of what it was all about. But his point about those, and one that was also made by Kant, was that in order to make effective use of objects, people need to have certain objects reserved at their disposal and for their own use at certain times and places. I can't effectively grow wheat to feed my family on a field if you can walk in, rip out my wheat, and substitute your barley at any time. Nor, of course, can I carry out my aim if you can simply walk off with my wheat. So long as the possible resources of action are finite, and in some cases movable, and the agents who can use those resources are also able to move among them, the possibility that two agents will try to use the same resource in contrary ways is a threat to that resource's usability. So in order to make the effective use of objects, you must be able to have what the children call dibs on them. You must be able to claim that at least for a certain stretch of time, you and you alone must have control over a thing, the use of a thing. In other words, there must be such a thing as property rights, and therefore there must be such a thing as justice. And yet justice and property, so conceived, are perspective-dependent idealities that exist only in the minds of beings who face the kind of problem that I've just been describing, the problem of dividing up the world's resources in a way that makes them usable by agents. And notice that this is true even if we suppose that a non-rational animal's territory counts as a form of property. For even if the animal doesn't conceive it that way, territory is in fact a solution, an evolutionary solution, to pretty much the same kind of problem that distributive justice solves. Territory in that sense is perspective dependent, since it exists only in the minds of those who have that problem, whether they know that they have the problem or not. But when you do know that you have the problem, and you're in a position to think about it, as self-conscious agents are, then you're also in a position to do something else. You're in a position to give the solution to the problem, even before you have that solution, a name. The name designates whatever solves the problem and gives you a way of talking to yourself and others about what you're doing when you try to solve it. This kind of talk is, very roughly speaking, philosophy, although I will try to make this characterization more specific later on. Now, in order to illustrate the point, I'm going to return to my disquisition on the metaphysics of furniture. Two-legged creatures like ourselves face a certain problem, which is that we occasionally need to sit down, and that for various reasons it's not always comfortable or convenient, or in some cases even feasible, to sit on the ground. We give this problem a name. The name is seat. I'm looking for a seat, you say, when you need to sit down. Seats exist, although only in the perspective of beings who face this problem, and they appear in scientific explanations only when we're talking about beings who are facing and perhaps solving the problem. It's not up to us whether seats exist, since it's not up to us whether we have this problem, and it's not completely up to us what counts as a seat. You may be able to make yourself comfortable on a dozing camel if you can keep the animal calm, but you can't sit on a grain of sand or the edge of a knife or the flame of a candle. But out there in nature, a flat rock or a log makes an excellent seat. Not being satisfied with those options, however, quite early on, human beings began to solve this problem in a practical way by making things that solve the problem of the seat. Objects that solve the problem of the seat are called chairs, as well, of course, as sofas, couches, stools, ottomans, hassocks, and so forth. And these solutions can be better or worse. In some situations, sitting on a beanbag chair, for example, may only be marginally better than sitting on the ground. Okay, now return to values. The fact that we're reflective agents who do not automatically do what desire and instinct prompt us to do confronts us with problems. For as a reflective agent, you cannot treat the bare fact that something attracts you as a reason to try to go for it without further thought. Nor can you treat the fact that an act would promote some end you've decided to go for as settling the question what you should do, because the act that promotes your end might not be, in various ways, worth it. There might be prudential or moral costs, for instance. So we have to have some way of making these decisions, some procedure or principle to follow. These two problems are the problems of the good and the right, respectively. The problem of what to go for, what to aim at, and the problem of what to do. They are not, of course, completely separate, because you cannot actually decide to go for something without first deciding that there's some way of going for it, that is, some action that would promote or achieve it, that you might conceivably find it worth it to do. But of course, you can't even generate some candidate actions to consider doing without first settling on some things that you might like to go for. So insofar as we're reflective agents, we're faced with these two interlocking problems. And I want you to keep in mind that the two problems are interlocking because that will matter later on. So the trouble with non-cognitivist or expressivist accounts of our values is not simply that it renders our values perspective dependent or mind dependent. It's that they left something out of their account. Actually, I think they leave out two things, although they're closely related. First, they left out an account like the one I've just given of what problem in human life values solve. They left out the account that shows why we must have values. The ancestors of the non-cognitivists, sentimentalist philosophers like Hume and Hutcheson, said that we have values simply because we have certain other attitudes, in particular approvals and disapprovals. In later versions of this kind of theory, the mental states or attitudes that give rise to values are different, especially in the various versions of Alan Gibbard's theory. They're norms or plans, for example. But to explain why human beings naturally generate the kinds of attitudes that are expressed by value talk is not the same as to explain the kind of stake we have in our values, and why we think it is that only some things can be valuable and not others. For that, we have to know more about what problem they solve for us, and how they have to be a certain way in order to solve the problem. And as that implies, for the case of values, the problem must not be one that can be solved in too many different ways. For the values of right and wrong, in fact, we seek a problem that can only be solved in one way, or at least not too many, for here we think we get answers that are absolutely correct and incorrect. If there's only one solution to a problem, then the object picked out by that solution, even if it is an ideal entity, is on solid metaphysical ground. Imagine, if you can, that our shapes were so peculiar that there's really only one kind of thing that could function as a seat, so that we could firmly say of either object that it was a seat or it was not. We want right and wrong to be like that. But what about the good? Now here we run into a little difficulty. It will sound paradoxical if I now say, as I am indeed tempted to do, that it's enough to identify a problem whose solutions, like the problem of the seat, can be better or worse. That's paradoxical because better and worse are themselves normative words essentially related to the idea of the good. And this is no incidental difficulty, because you might think it shows that it's a mistake to try to give this account of the existence of the good. We can't say that the good itself is the best solution to a certain problem. In fact, even in cases where there is only one solution, to say that much, to say that something counts as a solution, is to indicate some positive relation between the problem and the thing proposed. So it's to say something that is already valenced. So don't we just have to take valence as a fundamental feature of reality? I won't be able to respond to this problem properly until my story is told, so for now, let me just acknowledge the worry and say what I think its significance is. The significance is this: good, and more especially the valenceness of good, may not be fundamental with respect to the natural world, but it is, in a sense, the fundamental concept of the practical normative realm. If qualia give us the hard problem of consciousness, then valence gives us the hard problem of practical normativity. When we ask about the natural history of the good, we are not asking for anything less than an account of how the natural world acquired a normative dimension, how the world of value came into existence at all. Now, returning now from the sublime to the ridiculous, I'm going to make a few more points based on my analogy with furniture. We can use the account I just gave of seats and chairs to give scientific explanations of why people, or more generally self-conscious agents, who face the problem named by the concept of the seat, think thoughts about seats. That is, because they face the problem, because they face that problem, self-conscious agents think thoughts in which the concept seat appears. In the same way, we can use human Kant's explanation of the problem solved by justice and property to explain why self-conscious agents who face that problem, call it the problem of scarce resources of action for short, think thoughts in which concepts like justice and property appear. This in turn is important because it solves some other problems. First, I said earlier that thoughts involving the concepts that name problems are, roughly speaking, philosophical thoughts. And that fact in itself solves a problem. Suppose two philosophers are arguing about what justice is. One of them says that justice is the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and the other one says that justice is equal freedom for all. Why should we see them as disagreeing rather than as simply using the same word for two different things? Why can't we end their dispute just by telling them to use different words? After all, it's not like a case in which we're disagreeing about how to apply some established standard of justice, since it's the lack of an established standard that makes the problem a philosophical one. We won't know what's just until after we have a standard of justice. Well, the answer is that when the two philosophers call both of these things justice, they are denominating them as the best way to solve a certain problem. Say, the problem of how to distribute scarce resources of action to agents. That's what they're arguing about, and that's why their disagreement is a real one. Now, the second point brings me back to Harman's proposal that we need not believe in moral facts because we don't need them for scientific explanations. We can just talk about people's moral beliefs instead. That still leaves something in need of a scientific explanation. If people's moral beliefs are beliefs that deploy concepts like right and wrong and ought and reason, then we still need to give an explanation of why people think thoughts that are couched in these concepts. Why do we think about such things? It's no use saying that people acquired those concepts as part of their upbringing, since if they acquired them that way, they acquired them from other people who are using them, and we're just left with the question how those people acquired them. Now, one way to explain why people use those concepts would be to say that somewhere along the line they had an encounter with moral facts. But that creates a philosophical problem that we should not have to solve. It makes it necessary for us to add an explanation of why these particular properties, right and wrong and ought and reason, are especially well suited to play a role in guiding deliberation and action. In fact, all we can say about what we mean when we use those concepts is given by the role that they play in the guidance of deliberation and action. To say that something's right is just to say that you should do it, or in some contexts that you may. To say that it's wrong is to say that you should not. Or rather, since should is just another deliberation and action guiding word, perhaps I should say that the use of right just indicates that you've decided in favor of it, and wrong indicates that you've decided against it. So it should be neither possible nor necessary to add an explanation of why the properties of rightness and wrongness play the deliberative role that they do. In fact, given that we in any case need to decide what to do, it can seem rather magical to suppose that the world happens to supply facts and properties perfectly appropriate to guide our deliberations. The solution to our problem was not generated by those properties, but those properties are luckily on hand. In this respect, the concepts of right and wrong are like the concept of a seat. We did not first encounter seats in nature, give them that name because they shared a certain property that was completely independent of our problems about sitting down, and then later or separately discover that things with that property turned out to be especially appropriate places to sit down. Seat is just our name for something you can sit down on. So it is neither necessary nor possible to provide an explanation of why seats are especially appropriate places to sit down. Human beings who faced the problem of the seat invented physical objects to solve it, chairs and stools and ottomans and things. But human beings also face problems of a purely conceptual nature, problems that can only be solved by objects that are pure idealities. Being self-conscious, we give these problems names, thus creating concepts, and then we try to solve them. That activity is more specifically now philosophy, as it is conceived by Kantian constructivists, and the concepts are the ones that we usually call a priori concepts. We've already seen some examples of practical concepts like this in my sketch of the concepts of the right and the good. Often, when the problem eludes us, the work of the philosopher is to unpack the problem itself, giving a more thorough description of its contours. This is one way to understand what John Rawls is doing when he constructs the original position, for instance. He's showing us the specific contours that the problem of distribution takes in a liberal society. Get a sufficiently good description of the problem, and the solution drops right out. Now, there are also such concepts, of course, in the theoretical realm. Although I can't give you a proper account of the matter here, I'm going to ask you to entertain a certain possibility. Suppose that our efforts to do the job of theoretical reason, to understand things, confront us with certain problems. Let's say that the job of theoretical reason is to construct a representation of the world that will enable you to find your way around in it and to act in it effectively. And suppose that the problem this presents you with can only be solved by the deployment of the concept cause. It's easy enough to imagine, at least in a vague sort of way, how this story might go, because it's hard to imagine what the familiar activities of predicting, explaining, and understanding would be if we did not deploy the concept of cause. After all, cause in the scientific sense is one of the species of what Aristotle called aiteia, reasons why, Aristotle's 4 famous reasons why. Cause is our general name for the solution to the problem of understanding. So we need to find causes in the world just like we need to find seats. It's even easier to imagine how the story would go if we added in the idea that part of the point of a representation of the world is to enable you to act in it. For to be an agent is just to make yourself into a kind of cause. That, as I've argued elsewhere, is why we have to follow what Kant calls the hypothetical imperative, the command to take the means to your ends, because that's how we cause things. And of course, you can't do that unless the world itself contains causal connections of which you can avail yourself to bring about the ends you have in mind. So the cognitive tasks of both understanding and practical deliberation require that we should find causes in the world. Now, if some story along those lines is true, then consider the implications for the reductive naturalist. He says we should only believe in an entity if we need it to give us good causal explanation of the way things appear to us. But he still has to explain something else, which is why he himself is deploying the concept of cause. Is his view that the existence of causes provides the best causal explanation of why he finds that he must traffic in the concept of cause? I doubt if that makes any sense, but even if it does, trouble comes from the fact that there's another reason why he needs to traffic in the concept of cause, which is that he is an agent. This puts him in the same position as the moral realist who thinks that the world supplies properties of rightness and wrongness which are no way generated by the problem that practical deliberation poses, and yet which magically appear and offer themselves as guides to practical deliberation. It should be neither possible nor necessary to give an explanation of why causes are what enable us to understand things. Reductive naturalism, in my view, cannot serve as a standalone position because it cannot give the correct account of the concept of cause that it deploys. We need to be Kantian constructivists or at least some kind of non-reductive naturalists to do that. Okay, now I can explain what I'm going to do. As I've already suggested, I think that good is the name for our solution to a practical problem. It's the solution to the problem what to aim at, the problem of deciding what to seek and avoid. This is a problem faced by certain kinds of beings, agents, which is to say people and the other animals, anyone that in any way has to make decisions about what to go for. The good is therefore something perspective dependent, existing only in the perspective of agents. Since good is also the fundamental normative concept, the one that most immediately carries the fundamental property of valence, this means that the normative world exists in the perspective of agents. So the explanation of the existence of the good is going to rest in the fact that there are agents. What most immediately exists in the perspective of agents, however, is not the good, but their own good, the things that are good for them. So the first part of my story will be to convince you that the notion of good for is prior to the notion of the good. In general, my explanation of why there's such a thing as the good is going to be turn on the fact that there are beings for whom things can be good. Now, I want to begin my account by noticing something else that I think we should find puzzling about our use of the concept of good. As what I said at the beginning suggests, we use the term good in various ways, and in particular, in two broadly different ways. First, good is our most general term of evaluation, a term we apply to nearly every kind of thing, or at least every kind of thing for which we have any use or interact with. Think of the wide variety of things we evaluate as good or bad. Cars, houses, machines and instruments, dogs and cats, food, weather, days, prose, pictures, movies, muscles and bones, people considered as occupying roles, such as mother, teacher, son, president, people considered just as people, among many other things. All of these things may be evaluated as good or bad. Evaluation is usually related to the purpose, role, or function of the entity that it's judged good or bad. An entity is good in the evaluative sense when it has the properties that enable it to serve its function, either its usual or natural function, or one we've assigned to it for some specific purpose. I'll just call that the evaluative use of good. As I've already indicated, I'm going to call good in the second sense in which we use the term final good. We suppose there is something that we call the good, which is the end or aim of all our strivings, or at any rate, the crown of their success, the summum bonum, a state of affairs that's desirable or valuable for its own sake. We're usually talking about a person's final good when we speak of what is good for that person. That is, the things that are good or bad for a person are usually things that have some kind of impact on his final good. We sometimes call our own final good the human good, suggesting that things other than human beings have a final good of their own, and perhaps also suggesting that the good for a thing is relative to its specific nature. Now, the puzzle is simply this. What's the relation between the evaluative and the final sense of good? Why do we use the same word as a general term of positive evaluation and to designate the state that is the end and aim of all our strivings? I think that most people do not find this puzzling because they think that the answer is obvious. They think that when we talk about someone's final good, we are still using the term evaluatively. We're evaluating the person's life. I don't mean we're evaluating it morally. That would be more like an evaluation of the person himself. But we're evaluating something about how the life goes and the total circumstances in which it's lived. It's tempting to say that we're evaluating the quality of his life, but the phrase evaluating the quality just says the same thing twice over, namely that his life is a proper subject of evaluation. It's the sort of thing that can be of a high or low quality. But that's exactly the problem. How can a life and its circumstances be a proper subject of evaluation? Ordinarily, as I mentioned a moment ago, we evaluate things by asking whether they have the properties that enable them to perform their function. But a person's life and circumstances, considered just as such, don't seem to have any function. So how do we go about evaluating them? The function of a car is to serve as a mode of transportation for people and their various forms of baggage. So when we ask whether a car is good, we're asking whether it has the properties that enable a car to do this well, whether it handles well, gets good gas mileage, and is safe, for instance. But when we ask whether a person's life is good, we don't seem to be asking anything except whether the person whose life it is achieves that thing we call the good. This becomes particularly obvious if we want to leave open the possibility that the human good is something that's in a certain way external to life itself, the way it is on some conceptions of, say, nirvana or salvation. People who believe in those kinds of final goods do believe that human life has a purpose, but that purpose seems to be to enable us to achieve that thing we call the good. But then what are we evaluating when we talk about the good? Now, one might be tempted to say that we're evaluating possible ends, things we might pursue for their own sake. But then what's the function of an end? Or to put it more intelligibly, what makes something fit to be an end? Do ends, considered as such, have a role or a function? To say that they're ends seems to imply precisely that we don't want them for anything else. But then how do we propose to evaluate them when we ask whether they're good? Or if we're not evaluating them, what are we doing when we say that they're good? Apparently, we're just saying to be brought about for their own sakes. In other words, that they're finally good. Now, this is the kind of consideration that drove G.E. Moore to the view there is simply nothing we can say about the good except that it's the good. It's just a property. It also follows from More's theory that there's no way we can know what's good in the final sense except by a power of rational intuition that functions like a sense. If More is right, there's no point in trying to identify the good through philosophical argument. We just have to focus our powers of intuition. But we can't say what it is those powers do show us when we get them focused, because we still don't know what we mean when we say that final ends are good, except that they have some sort of property. Now, I'm going to be returning to that problem later in the lectures. But More provides me with a useful way into my argument, because More saw something clearly that many of his followers have failed to see. I am asserting the priority of good for, in the sense of good for someone, over that of good. More's view is at the opposite extreme. More asserted not only that good is prior, but that good for, in the sense of good for someone, cannot mean anything at all. This shows up in the course of his refutation of rational egoism, which he understands as the view that I should aim at the things that are good for me. In Principia Ethica, More wrote, this passage on your handout, in what sense can a thing be good for me? It's obvious, if we reflect, that the only thing which can belong to me, which can be mine, is something which is good, and not the fact that it's good. When, therefore, I talk of anything I get as my own good, I must mean either that the thing I get is good, or that my possessing it is good. And in both cases, it's only the thing or the possession of it which is mine, and not the goodness of that thing or possession. There is no longer any meaning in attaching the my to our predicate and saying, the possession of this by me is my good. In other words, I may have something good, and in that sense the good is mine. The good thing belongs to me. But according to More, its goodness is not in any special way mine. Or it may be a good thing that I should have something, but again, the goodness of that state of affairs, according to More, is not in any special way my own. So it turns out that there's actually no sense to be given to the idea of a person's own good. And More plainly takes the concept of my own good to be equivalent to that of what is good for me. So More thinks there's no sense to be given to the idea that something's good for me. Now, there are indeed problems about the notion of my own good in the sense that seems to be wanted for rational egoism. In the sense wanted for rational egoism, there's supposed to be something exclusive about one's own good, as if a part of what is good had in general been fenced off for your particular use. Caring only about your own good is supposed, as a matter of conceptual necessity, to imply not caring about the good of others, unless, as it happens, their good is part of your own. But how exactly we're supposed to draw these boundaries is a little unclear. Suppose that, unlike More, we think that the good has something to do with the satisfaction of desire, as many philosophers do. Then we might suppose, as a first pass, that rational egoism is the view that it is rational to seek the satisfaction only of my own desires. But there are true forms of trouble with this. To see the first, we need to get some moral psychology into place. Traditionally, people who have held this sort of view have also thought that desires are the only things that provide us with motives. More plausibly, we might take the Kantian view that we describe someone as having a desire when he is experiencing something that can serve as an incentive for his will. For instance, we say that someone wants food when he is experiencing hunger, or that he wants to help when he is experiencing sympathy. To say that his hunger or his sympathy are incentives is to say that he might take his hunger or his sympathy as a reason to act, and his decision to do that counts as his motive. Now, although on this view desire is not a motive, it's still true on this view that a complete list of a person's possible motives will be given with a complete list of his desires, because that'll be a list of all of the incentives that he's subject to. So on either of these psychological theories, the same problem arises. The claim that you must act only on your own motives is not a requirement of practical rationality, but a conceptual necessity. Of course, you cannot act on motives that you do not have. The other problem is easier to state. It's that this theory puts no limitation whatever on the content of the desires you might have or the incentives to which you might be subject. Your desires might, for all the theory tells us, all be for world peace and the happiness of others, and it seems funny to call that egoism. Now, responding to this worry, Bernard Williams once proposed that we could identify the egoist as someone whose desires have a certain kind of content. Williams says, it's on the handout, the trouble with the egoist is not that it is desires that he expresses, nor that they are his desires. The trouble is that all his desires are for things for him. Borrowing a device from Anthony Kenny, Williams proposed that we can isolate a category of egoistic desire by means of a device intended to identify the content of our desires generally. It might help if you look at the handout here. The device is to represent the desire in this way. I want that, and then in the parentheses there's some state of affairs that you want to obtain described. So every desire is represented as for a state of affairs. So what we put in the parentheses is the desired state of affairs. Then Williams suggested we could say that the desire is egoistic if the self appears somewhere in that description. I want that I, such and such. Whereas it's not egoistic if the description is, for instance, I want there to be peace all over the world. Williams calls such a desire an I desire. We might call it an egoistic desire. But actually, this device does not seem to capture the intuitive idea of egoism. What it seems to capture is rather the idea of narcissism. For instance, someone in the grip of a case of pathological remorse or masochism might want that he should suffer. Or someone might want to be the author of some good thing of which he himself may never get the benefit, like someone who wants to be the one who discovers a cure for cancer. And then there are the desires we would most naturally formulate not in terms of I, but in terms of my or my own, like the Godfather's desire that his own family should remain in power, or the patriot's desire that his own country should be free. Or suppose an artist wants his own paintings to make the world a more beautiful place. Are those desires egoistic? They contain a self-reference, but they certainly don't seem to concern things that you want for yourself in any intuitive sense. Now, of course, we could say that a desire is only egoistic if the person wants something that is good for himself. But then we cannot use these desires to define or rope off the notion of a person's own good, at least not if good for himself and his own good are supposed to describe the very same notion. On this view, we have to say what counts as good for you before we can say what counts as your own good. Now, the same problem arises if we take one of Moore's suggestions. Moore's argument suggests there are two basic ways we might construct the notion of one's own good, starting from the notion of good. One is by saying that what is good for you is having something good, and the other is by saying is that something is good for you if it's good that you should have it. The problem that I'm talking about now, I should say, in fairness to Moore, he doesn't think either of these suggestions will work. That's why he thinks the idea of good for you just doesn't work at all. The problem I'm going to talk about now arises with the second of these suggestions, saying something is good for you if it's good that you should have it. The case Moore had in mind was one in which it's intrinsically good that you should have it. An intrinsically good thing, according to Moore, is what he called an organic unity, because the goodness of things, he believes, supervenes on rather complex sets of facts. Moore thought that we could identify intrinsic goods by what he called the test of isolation. This means that something is intrinsically good only if it is the case that it would be good even if it were the only thing in the universe, showing that its intrinsic properties are sufficient to render it good. Now, this limitation seems important at first because we can certainly think of lots of cases in which it might be good as a means to further ends that I should have something, but in which it would seem at least questionable that it would be good for me. If I am a brutal dictator, it might be good that I have inoperable cancer. If I am a prehistoric pregnant woman, it might be good that I'm carrying a gene that 10,000 years later will make it easier for human beings to adapt to climate change. If I am a pacifist, it might be good that I'm the one who has possession of the gun. But it's at least questionable that inoperable cancer, a gene that will be useful millennia from now, or an unwanted gun are good for the people who have them. But actually, insisting that the state of affairs in which you have something must be intrinsically good doesn't solve the problem here. If a state of affairs is good in any way, including instrumentally, it must be possible to describe it as part of some intrinsically valuable state of affairs. And if any state of affairs is ever actually intrinsically good, it will be capable of conferring value on the things that brought it about. Suppose that it is good that the brutal dictator has inoperable cancer because his early death will enable many people to live happy lives who would not have done so had he died later. If the state of affairs in which those people live happy lives passes the test of isolation and so is intrinsically good, then so does the state of affairs in which the dictator has inoperable cancer as a result of which they live happy lives. But then it's good that he has inoperable cancer. And on the proposed definition, it looks like that means it's good for him to have inoperable cancer. Now, the problem here is the same as the one with William's proposal. We cannot identify what is good for you as that part of the good in which you participate or take part. Moore is aware of this difficulty. He responds that if we isolate the state of affairs in which the dictator has inoperable cancer, its intrinsic worthlessness will become apparent. So the criterion would have to be that something is good for you only if the bare fact of your having it all by itself strikes us as intrinsically good. This proposal is no doubt logically unassailable, but I think that's because we will only have this intuition in cases in which, intuitively speaking, the thing is good for you. In other words, our intuitions about what is good for someone are what support our intuitions about what it's intrinsically good that he should have, and not the other way around. Moore could dispute that, of course, but Moore himself was eventually driven to the view that the complex sets of facts on which intrinsic goodness supervenes always includes the people or other sentient beings for whom, as I would prefer to say, the situation is a good one. For even if you reject the notion of good for, intuition balks at ascribing intrinsic goodness to, say, inanimate objects or states of things which are unappreciated or unenjoyed by any conscious beings who are capable of appreciating or enjoying them. So what is good turns out to be, for example, not just this beautiful sunset, but someone observing this beautiful sunset with a proper attitude of awed appreciation. In other words, we achieve the good by throwing in someone for whom it's good. So Moore's right, but his argument doesn't show that the idea of something's being good for someone is senseless. Rather, it shows that if we start from the idea of the good, we cannot reach the idea of something's being good for someone by roping off that part of the good that pertains to him. What the argument shows is not merely the fallacy of rational egoism, but the hopelessness of trying to construct the idea of good for out of the idea of good. But of course, I'm not entitled to this conclusion yet, because Moore offered us another possibility that probably you find more tempting anyway. That's the possibility that's what's good for you is having something good. And that's the possibility that we will start with tomorrow. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, but so first a question, though, and then a couple of critical comments, though. So the question is, are you going to assume in what follows that we have an implication that if something is good for someone, then it's good? Because you suggested something like this today, but with some qualifications. So, but
I am going to trace a route from the idea that something's good for someone to the idea of the good. It's not going to follow that if anything is good for anybody, then that thing is necessarily itself good.
So good,
But,
okay.
But I acknowledge, I mean, I gave Moore a problem, or Moore gave himself a problem of going from good to good for.
Yes.
If I start with good, then I've got the same problem in the other direction. I have to show how you get from good for to good.
Of course, but there is no automatic implication.
No, there are no automatic implications.
Right.
No.
Then one thing about Williams, the quote that you gave us about egoistic desires. So his suggestion was, well, let me quote, "The trouble with the egoist is not that it is desires that he expresses, it's not that it is desires that he expresses, not that they are his desires. The trouble is that all his desires are things for him." And then, as you point out, you could be an egotist or narcissist, and then all your desires are desires for you, right, of things for you, but you are not an egoist. But can't it be that Williams is just giving a necessary condition here? So if you are an egoist, then all the content of all your desires is that are things for you, but that's not a sufficient condition on the content of egoistic desire.
Well, that could be his view, and then my point would be to challenge someone to find a route from there to a conception of your own good, or what's good, or to a conception of your own good which does not presuppose the idea of something's being good for you.
Okay,
Because my claim about that is the only way to get the right content of the desires
I see. You would say,
to take
okay,
good
so
for you to come
please
first.
continue, and
yeah,
so what's your?
right.
But then the proposal but maybe this is not your full proposal. But you have a solution on the handout. We only count the desires egoistic when what I want is something good for me. So there are two reflections here. Well, it could be that I have an intuitive and egoistic desire for something that actually isn't good for me. I might be mistaken. That's one thing. On the other hand, it could be that I have a desire for something that's good for me, and maybe all my desires are for things that are good for me, but that doesn't make me an egoist, because I desire them for other reasons, not because they are good for me.
As a fact about your psychological conditions,
Yes,
so to speak.
yes, right.
Right. I agree with you about that. I'm not sure that I see any reason why I should find it worrying in terms of
No, so
the
it's
attempt to.
simply a small remark,
Yeah.
but kind of as it stands,
Right.
doesn't seem to be. So I would say, just like you say to Williams, please continue. Account. But then something that you said in the beginning about backpassers, and you said, well, they have this problem of explaining the Valence, right? So what's the difference between good and bad? So the explanation is in terms of the valence of the attitudes, right? Either those are positive and negative. And then you say, but surely something can have a positive value, but this something gives rise to gives reasons for negative attitude.
Yeah.
But isn't it the fact that it doesn't give rise to reasons for negative attitudes towards the value bearer? So isn't the kind of the standard backpassing approach, or I would call it the fitting attitudes approach, is that X is good if there are reasons to have a pro-attitude towards X, and X is bad if there are reasons to have a con-attitude towards X. So in both cases, when you just consider X itself as the object of the attitude, then I think you avoid the problem that you mentioned. But otherwise, of course, I agree that the good things can very well give reasons for lots of negative attitudes.
Well, that may be right. I'll have to think about that one some more. I think the other problem I mentioned in that context still holds, which is we've just now passed the problem of valence along to the attitudes.
I agree. Thank you.
Johan Renmark.
Okay, so I have a question about more in the early parts of the talk, and this idea about problems and solutions, and concepts that name the problems and concepts that name the solutions. And I mean, my worry, perhaps it's more a worry than a question, is that when it comes, for instance, to the good or the right, then the question is there such a thing as the problem in relation to these concepts? Maybe there is a whole cluster of problems that are related to what we say and think about the good. And in that case, how do we sort of decide on what the problem? I mean, if we're going to rely on some kind of fairly narrow understanding of what the problem is about in order to derive conclusions about the good or the right, then how do we decide on that? I mean, for instance, when it comes to deciding what to do, I mean, I think many of us, at least me, I mean, I aims come to me. I rarely sit down and sort of try to decide what to aim for. It's sort of almost like something I just discover my aims. I mean, there are other circumstances where I perhaps start talking and thinking in terms of good and the right, and that's more when I'm discussing with others how they behave or they criticize what I do. So there is this process of justifying our actions. So someone could say, this is the problem that the good and the right sort of might serve as solutions to. It's justifying to others. So there might be these different interpretations of what the problem is, and how do we decide among these interpretations? I mean, a chair seems much more straightforward than the good.
Well, yeah, it probably is more straightforward. I think that as far as how we decide, it's a little hard to give a general answer to this question, but in many cases, it's either there is a more specific problem in view, as when I talked about Rawls, and you could understand the construction of the original position as solving the problem of justice for a liberal society, where a liberal society is one that is supposed to maintain the idea that everyone should have an opportunity to pursue his own conception of the good, and that no one should be coerced into following anyone else's conception of the good. And then, it's just a matter of argument by argument showing that the assumptions that govern the original position are tied in the right way to the problem so described. So it's just a matter of general argument at that point. In other cases, I think it's more a matter of unpacking the problem at hand. So I think, for instance, I think of Kant as giving us a constructive answer to the question, what's right? And I think of Kant as doing this by unpacking certain elements in the situation of someone who has to decide what's right. And then again, you have to make arguments for these parts of the situations, but you can put in an argument that shows that any decision has to have a certain universal form, You can put in an argument that deciding what's right has to be in a certain way a free decision, otherwise it's not really a decision. The agent has to go on in a certain way, otherwise what he's deciding to do is not really an action. So, it's just all of those things have to be argued for case by case. So there isn't really a general answer. This is, in a way, this is just sort of a particular way of describing what we do in philosophy that I myself find helpful when I'm trying to think about what's going on in a given theory, is say, okay, what's his problem? How's he trying to solve it? And then you can kind of organize what the philosopher has done around this idea that he's unpacking a problem and showing you how it goes. And that sort of makes it easier to compare what different philosophers do to each other
I guess
as well.
the risk is that you sort of just shift the controversy. So there's controversy about how to understand the good, and then sort of one way of approaching that is by the problem at hand, but then the same controversies might sort of reappear in sort of identifying and defining what the problem is. So the existentialist will have perhaps one understanding of the role that the good plays in our decision making, sort of perhaps as a cover up for the fact that we just sort of brutally have to decide. Others might have other interpretations. So does this just sort of shift the controversy one step back rather than
It
give
might
us something
shift the controversy, but on the other hand, it might get the points of controversy into better focus. One of the things I mentioned about this picture of what we're up to is that it explains what exactly we're arguing about when we have very different conceptions of things. And if you think of rival conceptions of justice as things that are being presented to you as solutions to some kind of a distribution problem, that gives you some grounds for comparing them one to each other that you didn't have before. So, but I'm certainly not suggesting that this is such a mechanical method that it's going to make philosophy easy and uncontroversial. I'm not interested in putting myself out of business here. So.
I don't want to anticipate your fourth lecture, which deals with right and good. But in common language, actions are right or wrong, and things and states of mind are good or bad. But what is the relationship between those distinctions, right and wrong, and good and bad, according to your terminology? Is everything that is right is automatically good? I mean, if you make the possible combinations there, and what is wrong is bad, or do you consider these as two separate?
Well, I think there are two different questions actually at issue in what you say. You say that in common language, actions are right and wrong, but it's objects and states of affairs that are good or bad. But in fact, until sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century, most moral philosophers talked as freely about the goodness of action as they did about its rightness. And it is certainly possible for a philosopher to think that action itself is something that has a function, and that actions can be more or less good at serving their function. Where by an action now, I don't mean, this is an important distinction, it has to do with the way you describe what action is in general. I think a common assumption that utilitarians make is that action is a form of production. The end is given to you from outside, from desire or some theory of the good or something, and that the action is the means you take to it. And that's the thing you choose. An assumption shared by Kant and Aristotle, most explicitly, is that what you choose when you choose an action is to do an act for the sake of an end, where that whole thing is the description of the action. When you take that whole thing to be a description of the action, you don't have to say that the function of the action is just to bring about the end. It could have some other function. And in my book, Self-Constitution, I argue that it does, that the function of action is, in a way, self-constitution. That's a long, complicated argument. But if you think that action is the kind of thing that can have a function, then you can ask whether action itself can be good or bad of its kind. And you can ask whether the actions that are good of their kind are right actions. So that's a possible thing to think. And if you thought that, one thing you would be asking about the coincidence of the right and the good is whether actions that are good as actions are the right ones, which I do believe. Now, a completely different thing you could be asking about the right and the good is whether when you perform an action and do bring about an end, whether it's the case that if that action is right, the end that you therefore bring about is good. And I guess I don't think that's necessarily the case either, it's certainly not necessarily the case because the end that you may bring about may be in some way unexpected or not what you had in mind, but whether when you perform an action, the end that you intended to bring about is good. I think in every case where you do the right action, the end that you intended to bring about is probably better than any other one you could have achieved under the circumstances, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's what we would call good, because we do sometimes have to choose actions in very bad circumstances in which none of our options are great.
How much do you put in your notion of someone or a person, him, me? How thin or thick is your concept? Obviously it takes in us adults sitting here, can talk to each other, deliberate and so on, but if we go downwards to children who can't speak, they experience pleasure and pain. And as philosophers, I think we can allow a thought experiment. What about a newborn child? Has had no conscious experiences before it is born, then comes out, lives for some second, becomes conscious, get an enormous pain, and then dies. Was that pain a pain for someone in your way of talking of someone?
Okay, I will be saying quite a bit more about this in my third lecture when I address the question, what kinds of entities can have a good? My general answer to the question is going to be that any sentient animal is a being for whom things can be good or bad. But I will also be arguing that we might, within that category, make a distinction that's a kind of matter of degree about the extent to which the being is someone for whom things can be good or bad. It's a little hard for me to say how that goes without anticipating my argument, but I will be saying more about that. But the general answer is certainly not just adult human beings, but all sentient animals. And I'll say one other thing about that, which is children, I think, it's always important in thinking about children to remember that's not a kind of thing, that's a stage of life. I mean, I don't think there is a question whether children have a good. People have a good, and that's the people who were the children. But I don't think there is a question whether children have a good.
Yeah, okay. So this connects somewhat to Johan's point here earlier. I was thinking about these two usages of good, the evaluative and the final. And you ask what's the connection. So do you entertain the possibility that it might be that it's a radically confused concept? So it's only the term that is the same, but it's really two different problems and two different concepts with the same term used for both. So and I mean, for instance, this final the good or summum bonum, that this might not be evaluative in any way, perhaps. Maybe it's just add together all these other ends or evaluative projects, goods that we have, just add them together and this compilation of all the other ends, this is the summum bonum.
Well, I certainly am going to say that on the whole, it's a mistake to think of good as it is used in the human good as an evaluative notion. There will be a way when I'm done with my story that you can make it be an evaluative notion, but I think the main function of the concept is, as I said, to mark out what to go for. The main function of the concept is its deliberative use. But I don't think that it's simply a confusion, like using the word bank for both the place you keep the money and the thing by the river, that we call both of these things good. And it seems to me that's implausible enough that it's worth trying to trace out what the connection between them is. Partly because even though I hope that once I put this problem before people, they realize there is a problem. As far as I know, most people have been quite unconscious of this problem and use the word good in both contexts, thinking they're meaning the same thing and without any sense of any problem. Whereas when somebody points out the thing to you about bank and bank, what you realize is not that, you've been treating something as one concept that was actually two. What you didn't notice was that the word was the same. But I don't think in the case of good and good, it's that people don't notice that the word is the same.
Well, I'm sure you will be talking about it much more later, but kind of the first reflection about this relationship between final good and evaluative good is that there are two things. So one, I perfectly agree with you that this idea of accounting for final good in terms of evaluative good, that's not a promising avenue. But of course, in a way, there's the avenue that goes in the other direction, and it's sort of very natural but rough idea, which says that, well, evaluative good, as you pointed out, it has to do with the function of the object or entity. So then, and final good is what's is to aim for, right? Well, then we say, well, if you are to create an entity like this, then what you are to aim for is this kind of version of the entity. This is the good kind of the entity in question. So you explain the evaluative good in terms of final good, but related to this particular aim of constructing an entity with a given function. But I don't know whether this sounds like a promising approach. In some cases it seems to work, in other cases it's not a very satisfactory solution.
Well, tomorrow I will be putting forward a somewhat different solution to the problem of how these things two things are related.
But not that one. Okay.
Not exactly that one. I think the trouble with the solution you described is that it seems to me that although if we are producing objects, our aims might be to produce ones, that are functionally good.
Yes.
It's certainly not a plausible candidate for the human good that you have a lot of well-functioning objects, even if that seems to be the 21st century conception of the matter.
Well, if you are producing a human being, then it's better, you should better do it. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. But another thing is that, but I guess that this is something also that you will be talking about, that in a way, when you say final good is what is to aim for, well, this sounds very much like a version of the fitting attitudes analysis. But in this case, what is to seems like a normative element here. So what's reasonable, right, or correct to aim for? We're aiming for is the attitudinal element. So doesn't it seem to be the same structure as the backpasser of Kant?
No, I don't think it is the same strategy as the buck passer, because what I'm talking about in what's to aim for is not just a matter of attitude, but actually something where action comes first.
Well,
and
it could be
attitude is
action, but it's sort of
subs-
a fitting response, right? So the idea is that something is good if it's fitting to respond to it in a positive way, in this case, by aiming for it.
It's very hard for me to address this until after I have my story
Okay.
before you. But that is not what I'm going to end up saying. So it's
Right,
not going to end
okay.
up just being a version of a fitting attitude view.
Look forward very much to your talk tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.